Thank you. Well, it's one of the things that makes it nice to be here in Chicago is it's sort of like, I suppose, speaking in Warsaw shortly after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, as freedom begins coming to a great city that has long been deprived of it. As Jim was talking about, the Heartland Institute's brief and the Independence Institute's brief were both cited early in Justice Alito's opinion for the Supreme Court in McDonald v. Chicago, ruling that the Second Amendment does, like most of the rest of the Bill of Rights, apply to the state and local governments via the 14th Amendment. And more recently, late last year, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the right to keep and bear arms actually does include the right to bear arms. And so Illinois could no longer be the only state in the country which prohibited anyone from carrying a firearm for lawful protection in public places. And Illinois did have, the exceptions that Illinois had were status-based. If you were perhaps a licensed security guard or an elected official, you were exempt from those restrictions, but ordinary citizens had no lawful way to carry arms for lawful self-defense. And the opinion was written by Judge Richard Posner, to his great credit, because Judge Posner is no emotional friend of the Second Amendment. After the Heller case was decided in 2008, he wrote an article in the New Republic criticizing the Heller decision, saying it had come out the wrong way. And then as McDonald v. Chicago was on its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, he wrote the opinion which was, joined the opinion, which was ultimately overturned in the McDonald case itself, ruling against at the time he would have upheld the Chicago handgun ban. But he then, when Moore v. Madigan, a collection of cases brought by the Second Amendment Foundation, the Illinois State Rifle Association, and the National Rifle Association, came to the Seventh Circuit, he faithfully followed what the U.S. Supreme Court had instructed in Heller and McDonald, and ruled against the handgun ban in Chicago, the carry ban in Illinois, to his tremendous and impressive display of intellectual honesty and judicial seriousness. And as you know, the Illinois legislature finally responded over the governor's veto by enacting a law like we have in almost every other state, and certainly every other state that surrounds Illinois. And you've got to drive a long way from here to find any state that is not like Illinois now in this regard, where a adult citizen who passes a fingerprint-based background check and a safety training class will be able to obtain a permit to carry a handgun for lawful protection. And I think one of the things that makes that, first of all, it's very important for those individuals who are able to prevent themselves from being victims of violent crime. But it's also a huge civil rights victory nationally, and of course especially in Chicago. What you may not realize living in Chicago land is how tremendously aberrational Chicago is compared to the rest of the United States. You think of, well, we're got more freedom than in New York because nobody ever tries to mess with our 18-ounce sodas. And that's true on some levels, but Chicago has long had on both in law and in practice, a far more oppressive gun control regime than New York City. New York City's never banned handguns. Back when they tried to cheat on the licensing system in the 70s, they were taken to court by my old friend David Kaplan and beaten, and had to issue handgun permits properly. New York City has gun stores in it. New York City has safe, licensed indoor firing ranges, and has outdoor shooting under safe conditions in places like Staten Island, where you can go skeet or trap shooting. And of course, Chicago has none of those things. No gun stores, no licensed ranges, complete prohibition on handguns for a nearly 30-year period. And so in Chicago, more than anywhere else in the United States, except for the District of Columbia, the culture of law-abiding gun ownership was suppressed and close to exterminated. And of course that's bad for the victim, the immediate victims of that themselves, the people who can't participate in the shooting sports or can't protect themselves. But it's also something that poisons the body politic, because it means that makes gun ownership more and more socially unusual. And so it's a vicious cycle by which more and more gun owners go underground. It's sort of like being gay in Oklahoma City in 1952. Maybe you are, and maybe your friends who are as well know that you are, but you don't talk about it in public very much. It becomes socially impolite. The Illinois concealed licensing reform will now move us back towards renormalizing gun ownership so that people don't have to hide in the closet and be afraid to tell their friends or coworkers that they have a carry permit. And for all the fear-mongering that's gone on in this country, particularly in places like Chicago, led by an often ignorant media about the supposed dangers of gun owners, well, starting in March and April, when you walk down great American streets like Michigan Avenue, you're going to be, I guarantee you, it is a statistical certainty that if you go out at any time when there's a bunch of people out there, which there usually are, this being Chicago, there's going to be licensed citizens carrying a handgun walking down the street as well. And that will happen day after day after day, and eventually some Chicagoans who have been terrified about gun owners because all they know is what they see in the media will come to the realization, oh, you know what? Since I'm I don't know actually who's carrying the guns, but since I've been walking around gun owners all day, every day when I'm walking around downtown Chicago, and to my great surprise, they didn't pull out a gun at the McDonald's in the theater district and start shooting people because the French fries were cold. And none of the other bad predictions came true either, that the licensed, trained citizens who exercise responsibly their right to bear arms are not a danger to anyone else. And so that formerly fearful person may not become pro-gun in a political sense, but it will dampen the intensity of the fear and of the anti-gun sentiment. It's the same kind of thing that happened in the South once desegregation finally got going, as there were a couple generations of politicians who had made their careers on making white people scared of black people. And if we don't have these laws, then that means when you go to the barber shop, the scissors that cut your hair might have been used to cut a black man's hair just 15 minutes before. And your little white 9-year-old girl would be going to school with a Negro boy in the class. And wouldn't that be terrible? And there were a lot of white voters in the South who believed those fears because they didn't know any better. And then once desegregation and the U.S. Constitution enforcement finally got going, lots of those formerly fearful people in the South discovered that maybe those fears were grossly exaggerated, and that having your children go to school with black people and sharing the same row in a movie theater and all those other things which had been prohibited based on fear really didn't make things one bit more dangerous or one bit less enjoyable. And so over time, a new generation of politicians came in the South who focused on more pragmatic concerns of citizens rather than this malicious, prejudiced, bigoted campaigning against another part of our population. The same thing is going to happen in Illinois because of the reforms, the relegalization of handguns in Chicago and the relegalization of bearing arms statewide means that Rahm Emanuel is not going to turn around and turn into a pro-gun guy, but it means that a generation from now, the mayor of Chicago and the governor of Illinois will probably try to advance their political agendas in ways that are more related to doing some good for the people of those jurisdictions, rather than trying to incite the fears of people who don't know any better and who are terrified of gun owners, because now more and more people will know about gun owners and who they are, and that they are responsible gun owners, are responsible, decent people to be around. The Second Amendment right is not something that is granted to us by the United States Constitution. The right to keep and bear arms is recognized in the United States Constitution, and it's formally protected by the United States Constitution, but it's not granted by the Constitution. On November 14th in New York City, I'll be debating Alan Dershowitz on the bit of a formal debate on the subject of should the Second Amendment be repealed. But what I'd say is, if you could repeal the Second Amendment, that's within the scope of what can happen in the Constitution, and you could likewise repeal the First Amendment. But if you repealed the First Amendment, it would not mean that people no longer have a right to free exercise of religion, to freedom of speech, and to assemble. And likewise, the repeal of the Second Amendment would not eliminate the right to keep and bear arms. It would eliminate the protection of those rights, the repeal of the First and Second Amendments, in our American Constitution. But it is beyond the power of any government to eliminate those rights itself, because those rights are not things that come from the government. They are inherent human rights. As the Supreme Court said in 1876, that the First Amendment right to assemble and the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms are found wherever civilization exists. These are natural rights that predate government. As the Declaration of Independence teaches, the very purpose of government, its primary purpose, is to protect the inherent inalienable rights which all human beings are granted by their Creator. So yes, Iran doesn't have a right of religious freedom, and you could imagine a place that doesn't have a right to keep and bear arms, such as Chicago, for much of the past 25 years, where the right existed nominally, but certainly was not enforced in a practical way before 2010. But the right still existed, even though the citizens of Iran or of Chicago were not able to rely on their government and their judicial system to protect that right. This is the fundamental understanding of the Second Amendment, made of the original public meaning, that was widely and essentially unanimously shared, that tracing back to the great Enlightenment philosophers, and even before them, John Locke, Hugo Grotius, Samuel Pufendorf, Barbarac, all the way back to Thomas Aquinas and beyond, that self-defense is an inherent human right. And from that right, which in some senses is the greatest of all rights, the most fundamental of all rights, it's possible to derive many principles of good government and law. One of them, a understanding widely shared at the time of the framers, is that, well, of course, we all agree that people have an inherent right of self-defense. Now, what's the difference for your inherent right of self-defense if you're riding along the highway and three guys come up to you with sabers or horse pistols and rob you and take your money and beat you up and maybe kill you? Well, of course, you have an inherent right to defend yourself against the lone criminal or a small gang of criminals. The principle of the American Revolution, strongly articulated by, among others, the Black Regiment of Congregationalist preachers in New England who helped incite the Revolution, and also by the Presbyterian ministers, Presbyterianism was the most national religion. They were all over in all the states. Was that inherent right of self-defense which you have against the highwayman applies just as much to when, instead of the criminal being one lout with two friends, the criminal is a lout who happens to be the head of a national government and has a standing army. And the armed buddies of his who he's sending to take away your inherent human rights, to steal your property, to oppress you, maybe to kill you, happened to be in the form of his minions in his standing army, rather than just the two guys he met at the tavern the night before. But the principle is the same. And again, this is a principle that goes all the way back to the early part of the second millennium, as articulated by the greatest Western philosophers. So there is no fundamental analytic distinction between self-defense against an individual criminal and self-defense against a criminal government. The Second Amendment is intended to facilitate both. In a practical sense, you can, as an individual, defend yourself against an individual criminal. It is not practical, and it is often imprudent and sometimes reckless, partly because of the risks of erroneous judgment or perceptions, for an individual to take on the cause of overthrowing a government. And that's the purpose of our states and of our militia, as protected by the Second Amendment. To say that if it seems possible that the government has grown so tyrannical or is so threateningly close to becoming tyrannical that armed resistance is necessary, then we have the mechanism through our well-regulated and organized militias, which are by necessity composed of individual citizens bearing their own arms of the kind in common use at the time, who can be organized for the kind of large resistance that would be needed. And it is the judgment of the states that a revolution would be necessary that helps guarantee that you don't have lone nuts, hotheads, or people with just reckless judgment saying now is the time for the revolution. The mediating institutions of government themselves are what help you know what the rare times are when a violent revolution might be necessary. And it was the fact that the 13 states agreed unanimously that the time had come for revolution, which made the American Revolution a legitimate Second Amendment revolution, and under the theory of what would be implicit in the Second Amendment, that because the intermediate magistrates, as they might have been called in 16th century political discourse, the states had decided that revolution was necessary. That's how you knew that it wasn't, oh, this is just Sam Adams getting all excited and he's had too much to drink and he'll probably found a great brewery one day, but who knows if we want to go run off the cliff with him. When it's the state government of Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and on and on and on that unanimously say the time has come, that's when you know the time has come. The right to arms was not particularly controversial in early American, in the period in the United States leading up until about the 1850s, when Kansas, in its own sort of Spanish Civil War type, the way the Spanish Civil War previewed World War II, the violence in Kansas in the 1850s was a preview of the American Civil War. The illegitimate pro-slavery Lecompton Convention government of the territory of Kansas, which had not seized power through a fair election, one of the things they did was disarm the free soil settlers so that they would be, and in fact were, easy prey for the marauding of the pro-slavery settlers, most notoriously in an incident known as the Sack of Lawrence. And this was something that came to the huge attention of Congress, was widely denounced, among others in the famous speech, I believe by Representative Sumner, the crime against Kansas. And he vehemently denounced the violation of the Second Amendment rights of the free soil settlers in Kansas, who had had their arms taken away from them by the territorial government. After the Civil War, the defeated ex-Confederate states readily accepted that slavery had to go and ratified the 13th Amendment quickly. But they were only willing to get rid of slavery in a nominal sense. What they did was quickly reenact what had been their slave codes, and now they were called the black codes. And so the same laws that had applied to slaves and often to free blacks as well in the South were now updated as the black codes, prohibiting, for example, more than a certain number of black people from assembling in public places without a permit in advance, making it illegal for a black man to not have a job, to not be under a labor contract with someone lasting at least a year, and either prohibiting the possession of arms by the freedmen or requiring that they have a special license to do so. Congress reacted with the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, with the Reconstruction Acts, the Civil Rights Act, and ultimately with the 14th Amendment to insist and make explicit that the national civil rights of all Americans, expressly including the personal right to keep and bear arms, applied to the states, and the states must obey and respect those laws, because that's one of the things that makes us a nation, is national respect for the national civil rights of our U.S. Constitution. And part of the theory of the 14th Amendment was the reason we got in this mess in the first place of a civil war in which 600,000 people died out of a population of 20 million was because the antebellum southern states had not respected those national civil rights. They had censored rigorously any speech which might criticize slavery, even on just purely economic terms and not on human rights terms. They had so suppressed political dialogue, and including dialogue from the pulpit, censoring what even ministers could say in the South, that's one of the things that made so many people in the South develop the extreme views that made them think that secession was legitimate and that slavery was, of course, God's will, and no reasonable person could disagree with that. The 14th Amendment aimed to eradicate root and branch the conditions which had led to the Civil War, the suppression of national civil rights, and to ensure that the gains of that war would not be lost, that from henceforth all states would have to respect all the national civil rights of the American people. There's whatever their color or condition. There's a long legal history of how that was initially thwarted by the Supreme Court, and then a lot of the country went along with that because they were exhausted from the decades of controversy and struggle. But we finally got it right, and part of getting things right was the McDonald v. Chicago decision in 2010 saying, yes, just like now, almost all the rest of the Bill of Rights applies to the states, so of course does the Second Amendment. The gun control debate in the United States begins to enter what we might recognize as its modern form in the 1920s, when, because of the catastrophe of alcohol prohibition, there was an increase in criminal gang violence. The solution of the Eastern business establishment was to say, well, we should ban handguns. And the Eastern business establishment was at this time an entity which was fairly used to getting its way once it decided what should be done. The National Rifle Association, founded in 1871, began major involvement in politics at this time and defeated handgun prohibition, in part because the NRA was able to support instead more reasonable laws such as licensing for the concealed carry of firearms as an alternative to outright prohibition. President Roosevelt's Attorney General, first Attorney General Homer Cummings, a highly inept Attorney General who was responsible for a lot of the New Deal losses in the Supreme Court in the 1930s through bad briefing, bad test cases, and poor attention to good statute writing in the first place, looked to England as his model for gun control and proposed, first of all, that handguns be regulated the same way that machine guns would be under the National Firearms Act through a highly restrictive and very expensive federal system of licensing and registration to put the cost out of reach of many ordinary American citizens. And when he didn't get that done on handguns, he kept coming back and pushing for handgun registration. He was defeated in Congress consistently. And then Congress in 1941, with World War II going on and war coming closer and closer to America's shores, Congress passed the Property Requisition Act, which authorized the national government to seize property with compensation that might be needed for the national defense. And Congress, when they passed the Property Requisition Act, specifically put in an amendment to that saying you may not ever seize guns from the American people, nor may you require the registration of guns, because the Congress in 1940 was vividly aware of what Hitler and Stalin had been doing in mass murders of populations whom they had first carefully disarmed and used registration lists to accomplish that disarmament. Now, this doesn't mean that every place that has gun registration will automatically have gun confiscation next, and it doesn't mean that every place that has gun confiscation automatically has genocide next. But what it does mean, and what Congress understood, is that when genocide and mass murder take place, the overwhelming historical record shows that the people who perpetrate the genocide, they're the ones doing it. They have the responsibility for it. They're the ones who actually think, well, how do we do this and make it work? What they say is we have to get the guns away from our victims first. First take the guns, then you begin the mass murder. Do that out of order, it's going to cause a lot of trouble. Our troops and our officers are going to get shot, which will make them reluctant to keep on doing it. It's going to cause all kinds of trouble, and so you disarm the intended victims first. And that same record has been played out again and again and again since World War II. In Idi Amin's Uganda, in Mao's China, in Cambodia under the Pol Pot, in essentially every genocide you can find in the last 100 years, victim disarmament always came first. Now, there are people who say, well, that's just ridiculous. How could a bunch of Jews with handguns fight off Nazis with tanks? Well, the answer is, whether it's the Nazis or the communists or a military dictatorship or just some guy like Idi Amin who's insane from venereal disease, whatever it is, whatever the motives, the guys who are in charge of the mass killings, they happen to think we've got to disarm the victims first. That's how they always work operationally. In the United States, there are lots of gun issues that come and go over time, and the flavor of the month or the flavor of the year will vary. And on any particular gun control issue, not gun prohibition, but gun control, there can be reasonable debate on both sides, because the Second Amendment does not forbid all forms of gun control. What it forbids, and I think is properly guided by the Supreme Court decisions, is it says the gun control laws that are constitutional are the ones that genuinely do help public safety without infringing people's rights. And there are laws that can do that. But the laws that really don't do any good to make people safer, and the laws which really do significantly impede people's ability to own firearms for lawful self-defense and carry them, and for other legitimate purposes, those are the laws which are unconstitutional. So let me give you an example of a law which I think is today unconstitutional under modern Supreme Court standards. And that's the ban on what are called assault weapons. Machine guns, as I mentioned, have been very, very, very stringently regulated ever since the National Firearms Act of 1934. The gun prohibition organizations, beginning in the late 80s, deliberately initiated what is a hoax, in essence, of saying, let's try to ban the guns that look like machine guns. And we'll call these assault weapons. If you see a U.S. Army M16 rifle, that is a machine gun carried by infantry soldiers. If you see an AR-15, the most popular rifle in the United States, owned by probably about 5 million copies in civilian hands, by far the best-selling rifle in the United States over the last 5 or 8 years, owned for many, many purposes. The two guns look the same. In fact, they are the same in many ways. The barrel's the same, the stock's the same, a lot's the same. What is different is something internally, which is the AR-15 is a semi-automatic, which means it can fire only one round of ammunition every time the trigger is pressed, just like every other normal gun. In contrast, the M16 has inside it the automatic sear, so if you press the trigger, ammunition will continue to come out in either as a tri-burst or repeatedly in a full automatic mode until all the ammunition is gone. But of course, people who don't know much about guns don't know about this internal difference, and so they think, in the words of Josh Sugarman, now the head of the Violence Policy Center, that if it looks like a machine gun, it must be a machine gun. Along with this are attempts to ban magazines. And what Heller seems to say is you cannot ban arms, which includes necessarily not only firearms, but magazines and ammunition. I mean, it would be a silly Second Amendment if it said, oh yeah, you can own any gun you want, but we can ban ammunition. Similarly saying you can have any crossbow you want, but you can't have the arrows for it. The bans magazines of up to 20 rounds for handguns and up to 30 rounds for rifles are not high-capacity magazines. They are the standard magazines that are supplied by the manufacturers with the gun when you buy the gun. And this is for some of the most popular firearms in the United States. For the rifles, it's guns like the AR-15, made by a wide variety of manufacturers, the Ruger Mini 14 and Mini 30, and quite a lot of others. And for handguns, it's popular companies like Glock or Springfield Armory, based here in Illinois. Many of their handguns come with standard magazines in the 16 to 20 round size. And yet, the Michael Bloomberg lobby tells people that the only reason that anyone would own a gun like the AR-15 or a magazine with more than 10 rounds is because they want to murder as many people as quickly as they can. That is a vicious blood libel. It is hate speech. It is something they are saying about literally tens of millions of American people who own these guns and who obviously are not interested in murdering a bunch of people quickly because they've owned these guns for years and have used them for legitimate things like target shooting, defense, hunting, as consistent with state regulations, and on and on and on. And these tens of millions of people have not been going around perpetrating mass murders. And yet Michael Bloomberg and his lobby tell you that these people have only one purpose, which is mass murder. And that is an atrocious, knowing lie. It is poisonous to the political dialogue. It would be one thing to say, well, we know that 99.99% of people with these arms or firearms or magazines are perfectly good, but we think that for whatever reason they're just too dangerous, so we want to ban them. That at least would be an honest thing that people could argue about, and I would argue the Second Amendment has settled that discussion. But at least you could have a legitimate discussion. But when you go out and you attack the people on the other side as incipient mass murderers, that is a truly evil thing to do. And Michael Bloomberg and the people who he employs to do this are not participating in the American gun control debate in a responsible way that American citizens should. The ultimate question that we face today in the Second Amendment debate is what has always been the question in the Second Amendment debate back in after Reconstruction, at the time of the American Revolution, and in our intellectual roots in Europe, which is, who is the sovereign? Is America to be ruled from the top down by a wise elite who will make decisions for people who are not capable of making them for themselves? And we hope, as is typically the case, say in France today on good days, that that elite has generally good intentions, and maybe they make mistakes, but they make mistakes with a good intention and not out of self-dealing or corruption. And they really do try to help the little people whose lives they are running. Or are we to be governed by the American model, which affirms that the people are the sovereigns? The people are the masters. The government is the servant. The government is the creation of the people, created for the purpose of serving the people as their agent and protecting their rights. And so that the people, as part of the sovereignty which they have not given up to the federal government or to a state or local government, but have reserved for themselves and never surrendered to anyone, the people retain their personal individual right to protect themselves and to have the tools which are necessary for that self-protection. That's the question that was debated by philosophers nearly 1,000 years ago. It's the question that was at the heart of the American Revolution, which, after all the arguments about taxes and admiralty courts and everything else, what turned a divisive political debate into actual division and separation and a war was gun confiscation. When the British ministry, in the fall starting in October of 1774, shut off gun and gunpowder imports into the United States, began pre-dawn raids to capture American stores of arms, and then on April 19, 1775, at Lexington and Concord, this pre-dawn raid had advance notice, and they were met by Americans with their own arms who were determined that their arms would not be confiscated. And so the issue we face today is, do you have the right, as an American who has not surrendered all government to Michael Bloomberg or to a national government, who still retains your own rights of self-government within your own sphere? Do you have the right to decide what size soda you're going to drink? To decide to pay for a doctor if your medical insurance or your Medicaid doesn't pay for it? Do you want to still have that right to do that and contract with a doctor on your own terms? And do you want to have the right, the choice, to have the right tools to protect yourself legitimately, using appropriate force within the bounds of the law? That's the ultimate question that the gun control debate has always been about. And it is the symbolic issue, on the one hand, but that many gun controllers have, of viewing gun ownership, and especially defensive gun ownership, as inherently disorderly and contrary to the highly regulated but not truly well-regulated society that they would like to see, versus other Americans who have a more individualistic understanding that the way we live cooperatively in society, as Samuel Pufendorf, one of the great Enlightenment philosophers, put it, that one of the things that makes cooperative living in a civilized society possible is the right of self-defense. Because when people don't have the right or the ability to defend themselves, then the weak become a prey to the strong, and the bonds of society necessarily dissolve. We've seen the catastrophe that has caused in places, in some neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., and in Chicago and in other places over this terrible period of gun prohibition from which we are finally emerging. Thank you.
We have time for lots of Q&A. So, David, you just want to point to the person?
Sure. Shoot.
You mentioned Mao Zedong, and this is more of a comment than a question, but the one quote that I remember from Mao Zedong relative to guns was that he said, power grows out of the barrel of a gun, and that made the assumption that they were the ones with the gun.
Yes, exactly. And to put it precisely, as translated from his little red book, as every communist must remember this, that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. The founding generation and the original public understanding of the Second Amendment agrees with that. And so that's why they say, because ultimately our sovereignty depended, as in the American Revolution and potentially in the future, our armament, we need to be able to have arms. And that's why the people have the right to keep and bear arms in the United States. Mao saw all that as well. It's the same principle, except he said, yes, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, and therefore, as soon as I take over, I'm going to disarm the entire population except for my state-armed minions, because I don't want the Chinese people to have any political power. I will pretend that I am ruling in their name, but they will have no choice in the matter, and I will be an absolute totalitarian dictator. And once we've disarmed the people, and of course China being a poor country, many people didn't have arms in the first place, then I can do all the things I really want, including playing propaganda radio all day, every day, that everybody has to listen to at work. You know, you think it's like annoying if somebody's got a, talk show and bad commercials on all the time when you're at work and you listen to it in the background. Imagine listening to it on a lousy AM radio with incessant communist propaganda coming at you every minute of your waking day. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the, in essence, ban on machine guns since the 1950s.
Yeah.
In light of the view of the Second Amendment now as an individual right, is that both wise and responsible policy? Why or why not?
All constitution, you can be as strong an originalist as one wants to be in constitutional theory, but the undeniable fact, observationally, just like Galileo said, well, it's fine to say that the world is the universe is centered on the Earth or whatever, but in fact the Earth does move. Observationally, the Constitution does. The Constitution exists as it lives in the hearts and minds of the American people and the content they put into that. And that's been true in the Second Amendment, as it has been in every other part of the Constitution. There's no evidence as of, say, 1790 or 1800 that the framers of the Constitution, that the Second Amendment was understood to say, oh, carrying a gun openly, that's fine. Carrying a gun concealed, that's really sketchy. We don't like that. The one's in the right and one is not. But the understanding that evolved and became the overwhelming consensus over the 19th century was that, of course, you have a right to carry guns, but that means to carry it openly and not carry it concealed, because why are you carrying concealed, unless you're trying to sneak up on somebody? And court decisions on the state constitution right to arms, and to the extent they address the Second Amendment, were consistent with that social consensus. There is a social, and of course now that consensus is sort of, in a way, is inverted, because folks who are reluctantly accepting that people have to be allowed to carry guns in Chicago now would much rather have those people be carrying their guns concealed rather than openly. And I think the Second Amendment has the flexibility in it to say, yes, there's going to be a right to arms, and including to bear arms, and it has to be a strong right. But in terms of the mode of how you carry, is it okay that the Second Amendment says, the Second Amendment allows a legislature in 1850 to say, yeah, carry openly, but don't carry concealed, and also could allow that same legislature in 2013 to say carry concealed, but don't carry openly? I think that the Second Amendment does have that much room in it. Machine guns are whatever else one can say, just outside the consensus of what Americans want in their right to keep and bear arms today. You can make policy arguments, pro or con on that, but that is clearly where the overwhelming majority of the American public is, and so there is no chance today that courts are going to deviate from that understanding. That said, the regulatory system that existed since 1934 does not, the gun ownership rate of people, the gun misuse rate of people who have gone through this licensing, very rigorous, oppressive registration and tax de facto licensing system, the crime rate with their machine guns is essentially nil. And all the more so today when a machine gun costs at least $5,000 just to get your basic one, and much more than that for others. So I would say states don't have any particular gain from outlawing machine gun ownership as long as that ownership is consistent with federal law. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, about 8 or 9 months ago in Slate, there was an article, the title of it was The Hitler Gun Control Myth, or something like that. And I'm wondering if you saw that article, and if not, I would suggest that you take a look at that before you use that as one of your arguments when you're meeting Professor Dershowitz, who I'm sure has read the article and is familiar with the facts. I don't know if the article is right or not.
Oh, I know it's wrong. First, Slate sometimes has accurate articles on gun control, but I'd urge everyone in internet land and elsewhere to pre-order the book from Stephen Holbrook, one of the preeminent scholars of firearms law and history, which I believe is called Guns in the Third Reich, or The Third Reich and Guns, but it's Halbrook. It's his newest book coming out in November, and it is the first book-length analysis of how gun control actually worked in the Third Reich. And it's about Germany, it's not about the occupied countries. And it shows how the Weimar Republic's gun control laws and gun registration laws, which were enacted with good intentions, ended up being such outstanding tools in the hands of the Nazis for the disarmament of any opposition in society, starting with the members of the Social Democratic Party, Jews, Gypsies, and it was about a 5-year process between when the Nazis took power in 1933 and then 1938, when they finally got around to even feeling a need to change and update and revise the Weimar Republic's gun laws. If you read Holbrook's book and study the history carefully, it is indisputable that the Weimar gun laws helped the Nazis in their objective, which they accomplished over that 5-year period, of forcing all of society into line and making resistance, which might have been possible in 1933 and 34, impossible by 1938. Yes, sir.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming back. You were one of our first authors that wrote for Heartland, and it was quality work then, and you continue to do your quality work. And thank you so much for coming back to visit us.
Well, thank you.
Now the question. Our illustrious Senator Dick Durbin has injected racism in the gun control debate, and it grew out of the Martin Zimmerman case, where it was mistakenly argued that the Stand Your Ground legislation was a big issue in that case. He went so far, Dick Durbin went so far as to propose legislation to require groups like ALEC to reveal their donors so that their donors could be accused of racism and supporting model legislation on gun control and other issues as well. And it forced ALEC to essentially withdraw their model legislation on the gun control issues. Do you think this new ingredient is going to impair the rights of citizens to bear arms? If so, how do we get over it?
The attack on the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a forum for conservative state legislators around the country where they meet at conferences and then they see ideas for model legislation on a variety of topics. The attack on ALEC using the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman pretext was something that was very well coordinated and set up in advance, and what really made ALEC crumble on this issue was not so much political pressure, but the way the false version of the Martin Zimmerman case spread on social media, and then lots of people who just sincerely believed it, didn't know any better, contacted, they said, X corporation, McDonald's gives $100,000 a year to ALEC, so call McDonald's and tell them to stop, supporting laws which make it easy, which promote the murder of innocent black teenagers. The important thing to remember about the essential mendacity of this is whatever you think about stand your ground laws, well, what the name implies is it's about, well, when can you stand your ground? The phrase is very old in Anglo-American law, was used in a late 19th century U.S. Supreme Court decision, which affirmed the traditional principle that a person who is attacked by a violent criminal does not have a duty to retreat, but may stand his ground and use force in self-defense. Now, you can be in favor of a law that says, no, people who are attacked should be obliged to retreat if they can do so safely, rather than use deadly force in self-defense. Or you can be in favor of the traditional stand your ground rule. We can have that debate. But what there is no legitimate debate about is that it had nothing to do with the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman case. You have two versions of the facts. One was the defense theory, which apparently was somewhat persuasive to the jury, which was that Martin attacked Zimmerman, got on top of him, a fit, young, muscular man on top of this chubby guy who was trying to exercise and making some progress, and was pounding his head into the concrete pavement of the sidewalk. In that situation, the victim would have no ability to retreat, so stand your ground would have nothing to do with it. On the other hand, the prosecution never really had a theory for exactly what happened, but it seemed to be that somehow, one way or another, they didn't really get into the details of exactly how this might have transpired, would be consistent with the evidence, but the prosecution's theory was that Zimmerman stalked Martin, went after him, and attacked him. Well, if that were the case, then again, stand your ground would have nothing to do with it, because stand your ground is the law for when the victim can stand his ground after being attacked by the criminal. Stand your ground doesn't have anything to do with a criminal stalking the victim. If stand your ground were, if the prosecution's theory of the case were relevant, then it would be Trayvon Martin, who would have had the right to stand his ground against an unprovoked attack by George Zimmerman. So whatever might have happened that night, and maybe no one will ever know the exact details for sure, but whatever might have happened, we can say with certainty that stand your ground had nothing to do with it. So it is awfully cynical of Senator Durbin and others to try to incite racial animosity on this issue over stand your ground laws. Yes, sir.
I just want to say I learned a lot today.
Yeah.
You brought up facts and stories, and this is the next part is rhetorical. I don't think this is being taught anywhere in American history classes in high schools in terms of, I don't even know if I was aware that the British were confiscating guns. I never heard of those stories. I certainly never heard of the Kansas one. And obviously this is deliberate, but does anybody ever talk about teaching American history the way it happened?
What a novel idea.
Good luck with that.
Because everything
Yeah.
you said is inarguable, and it's the truth, and it has bigger ramifications than just
work rules
taking guns away. It's more about who we are.
I think there are various organizations and individuals out there who are working to at least make more complete, more accurate and comprehensive and fairer materials available. And some of those are things that exist outside the formal instructional system, just books on American history, a primer on American history that people can buy. So there is some progress being made on that. But certainly one thing that people can do, that all citizens can do, and it's a very legitimate thing, and one of the things that does make America special, by the way, is public schools. We didn't have public schools in 1789, but as the nation's grown up, that has been one of the important things about America and about Americanization and all that, is schools usually have a process of some public comment on the selection of textbooks. So if you're interested in this, you can participate in that, and at the least probably have the opportunity to go down to the school district offices, and maybe you're familiar with biology, and there's 3 different 8th grade biology books that are under consideration, and you read through them and you can say, oh well, this one, this one had a great layout, and because I know biology, I found 15 factual errors in the other textbook. And you can likewise, if you've got the knowledge, do it on topics in American history. And it doesn't mean that the school board has to choose or the administration has to choose what you recommend, but you can at least have the input process, and I think that's a good way of being a proactive, good citizen, to provide your own knowledge, because school board members don't know everything about biology and physics and American history and world history and everything else. They're not omnicompetent on everything. So I think many would appreciate citizen input to help them choose the textbooks that are the most accurate. Yes, sir.
I'd like to thank you also for coming. My name's Charles Bell.
Yeah.
We work with Otis McDonald,
Yeah,
Second
yeah.
Amendment, and all that good stuff. And, one of the things that you did, I don't know,
Yeah.
I got here late,
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
yeah.
but I don't know if you covered the blue
Yeah.
gray gun laws, you kept the guns out of the military guns out of the hands of blacks after the
Yeah.
Civil War, and then you had Khrushchev, which is what
Yes.
the Chicago city tried to use as a defense for keeping guns
Yeah.
out of our hands. But I don't know, you guys should Google, it's called Sherry the View Wants to Get a Gun. It's the lady on the View, this black woman, and she talks about how their alarm went off one night, how she wanted a gun. So Barbara Walters said, oh, a gun.
Yeah.
And she is totally now, she and her husband are going to get gun training. I use that all the time because
Yeah.
I had a friend who lives in Hyde Park who says, how am I going to defend my home? He had the same thing happen. I said,
Right.
you need to go get yourself a gun and you need to get some training.
Exactly, and the training thing is important, and that's one of the reasons why the National Rifle Association is the oldest civil rights organization in the United States from 1871. Its job is to help train Americans in being responsible gun owners and users. If you, it's perfectly legal in this country to have a swimming pool built in your backyard, even if you don't know how to swim and you don't take lessons. And there's some people who can sort of be autodidacts on swimming, but it's probably preferable that you learn some basics from experienced people. And the same is true for people who are thinking of becoming first-time gun owners, is there are courses and the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the trade association for the industry, also does these courses. There's introductory 2 or 4 hour courses, and then more elaborate ones and lots of things. And that's a good and responsible thing to do. And I'm glad you mentioned those historical things, which I did touch on, but as long as I'm doing book commercials. Another book coming out, this is coming out in January of 2014, is called Negroes and Their Guns, published by my friend and co-author of a law school textbook, Nicholas Johnson of Fordham University. And he looks at black gun ownership from the very early days of American history up to the present, covers all the controversies in a very fair and carefully argued way. And one of the things that I liked about, that I really learned from the book, and even though I knew some of this, but he really makes one see it more clearly, is people today sort of have this image of, you know, what Johnson calls the nadir, the worst part of the post-Civil War racism, of the height of Jim Crow, the 1890s, 1910s. You think of blacks as just these highly oppressed victims, which of course they were. But what is not, I think, known even by many American historians is how much blacks, even under those very tough conditions, got arms and used them to resist racist violence. Sometimes at great personal risk to themselves or their communities for fighting back against a white lynch mob, but they often did so. And that was a very important part throughout of black consciousness and of black pride and of the black understanding of what it means to be an American and have rights. It was the right to protect yourself against racist violence.
He and I just
Yes.
said at the same time, Rosewood.
Yeah.
And my family's
Yeah.
from Florida, and that's what they did.
Yeah.
They defended themselves against guys who were trying to come in and kill them so they could take over their household, basically.
Exactly, and of course I believe was Rosewood 1923. Yeah, so famous anti-black riots there, and there's many examples. Some of them that became large and well-known historical incidents. Others that are much more obscure. But Johnson's book has a very inspiring range of American heroes in it, of people like Ida B. Wells, the newspaper writer and publisher of around the turn of the century with her Winchester rifle, of Daisy Bates and her husband L.C. Bates, leaders of the Arkansas NAACP, and also newspaper publishers in the 1950s and 60s, and their defensive arm against the Ku Klux Klan was the Colt 45 semi-automatic pistol. And these are some of the well-known ones, and there's a lot of others who you've never heard of before, and they all are really properly placed in the litany of great American heroes.
Time for 2 more questions.
Yes, sir.
What do you think of this term I hear on the media all the time, is gun violence? And there's a popular Facebook post where a guy studied his gun, he put it in the corner and watched it all night, and it never did anything. He never did the gun violence. And he watched it, and he was kind of worried about it, and nothing ever happened. So now we hear this term gun violence all the time, and it's like, it seems to be like, yeah, guns are terrible. Like, they're going to come and kill us with, just by themselves. So what are your thoughts of that, the media?
It's the focus grouped, tested term for gun banners to use these days. Back in the 1970s, you had groups that actually were named for what they wanted to do, like the National Coalition to Ban Handguns. They wanted to ban handguns, and there you are. And so if you want to ban handguns, support the group. If you don't want to ban handguns, that's probably not a good group to join. This morphed, and the handgun prohibitionists found that they could be somewhat more popular by, instead of saying ban, to say control, because there's lots of, self-control is a good thing. There's lots of ways that control has some positive connotations, and so then gun control became particularly the term of choice. But especially as after the debacle of the 1994 elections, where the Democrats lost both houses of Congress for the first time since the 1950s, because Bill Clinton led them over the gun control cliff with his assault weapons, so-called, with his ban on so-called assault weapons. The new marketing phrase became gun safety. And there was a big emphasis then on shifting the attention to like, oh, do it for the children, and like children are dying in gun accidents all the time, and all that, exactly. Right, and common sense gun safety. And so that was tried for a while, but did have and was probably a better phrase than gun control for marketing purposes. But among other things, control does have this sense of you're trying to control my life. So it was a turnoff for people. And everybody's in favor of safety. But on the other hand, since the people who were saying, I'm the gun safety advocate, were often people who actually hated guns and knew nothing about them, they actually looked somewhat weak sometimes compared to the lobbyist for the National Rifle Association, or who was actually working for a group that had a record of well over a century of actually promoting gun safety and teaching people how to be safe with guns. And so the latest focus group term is gun violence, rather than gun control or gun bans or gun safety. And similarly, and this is it's now a public document. The Bloomberg lobby had hired some very high quality PR consultants who wrote a 80-page manual for gun prohibitionists about how to market themselves. And this is for citizen activists. It was not so much written for the people who run organizations. But it says, for example, don't say, I'm for stricter gun laws. Say, I'm for stronger gun laws. And you can mean the same thing, and you can actually mean by stronger gun laws, I'm for banning as many guns as I can possibly get away with, but it sounds nicer when you say stronger laws. And so there's 90% of the rhetoric you heard in the weeks after Newtown was in alignment with the Bloomberg PR manual of this is how we're going to say things. Yes, sir.
Not all concealed bans are equal. I know there's Illinois actually, in a way, to still maintain a air of gun control, has a much stricter standards, higher costs for license, more hours, and I'm just wondering how you basically define. I know the difference between like a state with a less restrictive concealed weapon ban and one with this stricter. So there's still a big difference between the two.
Well, I think the core, what puts Illinois on the side that's probably consistent with the Second Amendment, at least as the initial inquiry, is in Illinois, starting late this year, and then with licenses being issued in 2014, is that are you a law-abiding, responsible adult citizen? Who's got safety training? If the answer is yes, is there a process you can go through which will lead to you getting a permit to carry a handgun for lawful protection in public? I mean, then the process is actually accessible. It's not something, well, you can only do it if you meet with a police officer, and the police officer is never available to meet with you because he's always on vacation. It's not a Kafkaesque thing, that it's a real functional system. And you can get that in Illinois. Now, in some counties in California or New York City or some other place, Hawaii, there may be in practice no way that the law-abiding responsible citizen can get that permit depending on which county in those states he lives in. So that's the difference. Now within, the differences between Minnesota's law versus the Wisconsin law versus the Illinois law versus Indiana, those are all the differences, and I think that probably over time, as Illinoisians, especially Chicagolanders, get more used to the reality of people carrying guns, that some of the more unnecessarily repressive parts of the Illinois law might be softened or modified, and that's certainly been the thing in a lot of states. It is a one-way ratchet in this case. No state that enacts shall issue licensed carry has ever gone back, and the details of the licensing laws within those, how the shall issue law operates, overwhelmingly the direction has been to make those laws less repressive over time, that you enact it at a pretty stringent level because that's what the people are ready for and the legislature is ready for. And then 5 or 10 years later, it's sort of a normal fact of life, and they say, oh, do we really need to, make the guy say "Mother, may I" 3 times before he hands in the permit? No, that really doesn't add much to the process, so we can get rid of that requirement. All right, thank you.